The air over the Jordan River carried the scent of dust and dry herbs. It was the kind of morning that deceived, calm on the surface, carrying beneath it the invisible weight of decisions that would echo for generations. Somewhere along the road between Samaria and the hills of Aram, two men were walking in opposite directions. One was returning from a miracle. The other was running toward a lie. This is not a story that begins with a villain. It begins with a servant. His name was Gehazi. And for years, he had walked in the shadow of one of the most powerful prophets in all of Israel. To understand what Gehazi did, you must first understand who he served. Elisha was not a man who accumulated things. He moved through the land of Israel like a force of nature, healing the sick, multiplying food, raising the dead, and confronting kings without flinching. He was the successor of Elijah, inheritor of a double portion of the Spirit that had parted waters and called down fire from heaven. Elisha needed no palace. He needed no treasury. His authority was not measured in silver, and yet, every great man casts a shadow, and in that shadow, things grow that the light never sees. Gehazi had served faithfully. He carried messages, managed logistics, stood at the door when powerful visitors arrived. He was close enough to witness the miracles, but perhaps never close enough to truly understand their cost. He saw the results without carrying the weight. He watched Elisha refuse payment, refuse gifts, refuse wealth, and perhaps, in the quiet of his own heart, he thought his master was simply careless, perhaps even foolish. That thought would destroy him. The story reaches its breaking point with the arrival of Naaman. Naaman was not a man you dismissed. He was commander of the armies of Aram, a nation that had repeatedly clashed with Israel. He wore his rank like armor even when he was not in uniform. He had won wars. He had built his reputation on blood, strategy, and iron discipline. And yet, beneath all of it, his skin was rotting. Leprosy had no respect for rank. It spread across his flesh regardless of his victories. And so this commander of armies, this man who could march thousands of soldiers into battle, had found himself being advised by a captured Israelite servant girl who told him that a prophet in Samaria could heal him. There is something profoundly human in that detail. Power humbled by disease, certainty dismantled by the body's quiet betrayal. Naaman came to Elisha carrying what power always carries, an assumption. He arrived with horses and chariots, with silver and gold, with fine garments, with the belief that healing was a transaction. He stood at Elisha's door expecting ceremony, expecting to be received with appropriate reverence, expecting the prophet to come out, call upon his God, make a dramatic gesture, and restore him in exchange for generous compensation. Instead, Elisha sent a messenger. "Go wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and your flesh will be restored." Naaman's reaction was fury. He had crossed hostile territory, humbled himself before a foreign prophet, and all he received was instructions to bathe in a river he considered inferior to the rivers of his own land. He nearly turned back. His pride almost cost him his healing, but his servants reasoned with him. If the prophet had asked something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more then when he simply says, "Wash and be clean." And so Naaman descended into the Jordan, once, twice, 3 times. The water was brown and slow-moving. There was no drama, no thunder, no visible sign. Just a man, submerging himself, swallowing his pride with each descent beneath the surface. On the 7th immersion, he rose from the water. His skin was like the skin of a child. He returned to Elisha transformed, not only in body, but in something deeper. The encounter had broken something inside him. He stood before the prophet and made a declaration that few military men of that era would dare make. "I know now that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." He offered gifts: silver, gold, clothing, 10 talents of silver alone, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time. Elisha refused, every coin of it. This was not stubbornness. This was theology. To accept payment would have implied that the healing was a product of Elisha's power, something earned, something bought. The miracle was not his to sell. He stood firm, and Naaman departed in peace, carrying with him not just restored flesh, but the first tremors of genuine faith. The road behind him was quiet. The transaction was closed, at least in the eyes of the prophet, but Gehazi was watching. And here is where the story transforms from miracle to tragedy. Gehazi watched all of this and felt something tighten inside his chest. 10 talents of silver, 2 changes of fine garments, and Elisha had simply sent it away. For what? For principle? For theology? Perhaps Gehazi told himself a story. Perhaps he convinced himself that Elisha was wrong, that the wealth was justified, that Naaman could certainly afford it, that no real harm would come from taking what had already been offered freely. Perhaps he even believed it. He ran after Naaman. The commander of armies saw a figure chasing him down the road and ordered his chariot to stop. He stepped down to meet Gehazi, because that is what you do when a prophet's servant pursues you. You pay attention. Gehazi constructed a lie with precision. He claimed Elisha had sent him. He said that 2 young men from the school of the prophets had arrived unexpectedly, and that a small gift, just 1 talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing, would be appreciated. Naaman, freshly healed and full of gratitude, did not hesitate. He gave 2 talents, not 1. He had his servants carry them part of the way back, and Gehazi hid them before returning to stand before Elisha as though nothing had happened. "Where did you come from, Gehazi?" The prophet's voice was measured, quiet. "Your servant did not go anywhere." The lie sat between them in the air like smoke. If you're finding this story as powerful as it is disturbing, you're not alone. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that history hides in plain sight, and you deserve to see all of them. Elisha already knew. This is the part of the story that people rarely sit with long enough. The prophet had not sent Gehazi. The prophet had not moved from where he stood. And yet something in the spirit of the man who had healed rivers, multiplied oil, and raised a boy from the dead, that same awareness that had guided his every step, had followed Gehazi down the road, had watched the exchange, had seen the silver change hands, had witnessed the lie being constructed in real time. "Did not my heart go with you," Elisha said, "when the man turned from his chariot to meet you?" It was not an accusation spoken in anger. It was something worse, a statement of sorrow. The kind of words a father speaks when he realizes his child has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. There was no shouting in that room. There was only the terrible stillness of consequence arriving. Gehazi had taken silver. He had taken garments. He had taken what was not his to take, and not merely in the sense of material theft. He had taken something far more destructive. He had taken a sacred moment and turned it into commerce. He had taken the testimony of a pagan commander who had just discovered the living God, a testimony built on the fact that no transaction had occurred, that healing had been given freely, and he had quietly, invisibly corrupted it from behind. Naaman would never know. But heaven had watched. What Elisha said next has echoed through centuries of theological reflection, and it deserves to be heard slowly. Is it a time to receive money and to receive garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. The leprosy of Naaman, not a new affliction invented as punishment. The very disease that had been lifted from the body of the Aramean commander, transferred by the mechanics of divine justice onto the man who had tried to profit from its healing. Gehazi left Elisha's presence leprous, white as snow. This is the moment the story demands you stop and breathe. There is a temptation when reading ancient texts to reduce the people in them to symbols, to see Gehazi simply as a cautionary figure, a prop in a moral lesson about greed. But that reading empties the story of its weight. Gehazi was a real man. He had spent years in faithful service. He had stood at doors, carried messages in dangerous times, navigated the complex political terrain that surrounded a prophet who regularly challenged kings. He was not a stranger to sacrifice. He was not a man who had never known difficulty, and that, perhaps, is exactly what made the temptation so lethal. He had seen the cost of faithfulness up close. He had watched Elisha refuse comfort, refuse wealth, refuse the accumulation that other men in positions of influence enjoyed freely. And somewhere in the long years of that service, a question had taken root, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps in the quiet of sleepless nights. What am I getting out of this? It is one of the oldest questions in human experience, and it is most dangerous not when it is asked by the corrupt, but when it is whispered to the faithful. Gehazi did not steal because he was evil. He rationalized because he was tired. And rationalization, the small, reasonable-sounding voice that says just this once, just this amount, no one will know, no real harm will come, has been the undoing of servants, leaders, and ordinary people across every civilization that has ever existed. He reached for what felt like compensation. What he received was ruin. The story of Gehazi does not end in that room with Elisha. In one of Scripture's most disorienting narrative turns, he appears again, years later, in conversation with the king of Israel, recounting the miracles of Elisha. The Shunammite woman whose son Elisha had raised from the dead arrives before the king at precisely that moment, and the king, astonished by the coincidence, restores everything she had lost. Gehazi, in this scene, is still present, still speaking, still, in some capacity, connected to the story of the prophet. What that scene means has been debated by scholars and theologians for centuries. Was he healed at some point? Was he still leprous and simply tolerated in the king's presence in a time of need? Was this a different Gehazi entirely? A disciple who shared the name? The text does not resolve the question cleanly, and perhaps that ambiguity is intentional, because the story of Gehazi is not meant to end in a single moment of clarity. It is meant to linger. Consequences linger. Choices echo. The leprosy that clung to him and his descendants was not only a physical mark, it was a reminder, carried through generations, that what we do in private shapes what we become in public, and that the things we take without authorization have a way of taking something from us in return. Step back from the individual story for a moment and look at the landscape it inhabits. The ancient Near East was a world defined by hierarchy and exchange. Wealth meant power. Gifts sealed alliances. A commander of armies was expected to pay for services rendered, and a man who refused such payment was considered, at best, eccentric, at worst, insulting. Elisha's refusal of Naaman's gifts was a countercultural act of deliberate theological statement. It said, "This healing belongs to a dimension of reality that silver cannot reach." Gehazi's action did not merely break a rule. It broke a statement. It took the living evidence of divine grace and quietly inserted a price tag on the back of it. And that is why the punishment was not simply financial ruin or exile or public shame. It was the reinstatement of the very disease that had been removed. The punishment fit not the crime, but the meaning of the crime. You cannot corrupt the testimony of healing and walk away unchanged. The story insists on this with the kind of gravity that does not soften with time. Across the centuries, this account has returned again and again in moments of institutional corruption, when those who stand close to power begin to believe that proximity entitles them, that service justifies private extraction, that the rules binding those in authority do not quite apply to those who merely facilitate authority. Gehazi is not a distant figure. He walks through every era. He sits in every organization, every religious institution, every court, every government. He is the aide who skims, the treasurer who borrows, the assistant who uses access for advantage. He is recognizable not because he is monstrous, but because he is ordinary, because the temptation he faced is one that ordinary people face in ordinary moments, dressed in the language of fairness and quiet desperation. And the story does not end with his exposure as a warning about getting caught. It ends with the transfer of the disease, with the image of a man walking out into the light, white-skinned, marked, carrying in his own body the evidence of what greed, unchecked, will eventually make visible. What we reach for in secret has a way of writing itself on our surface. What we take from sacred things does not stay hidden. History is not only the story of empires and battles. It is the story of choices made in corridors and roads, in quiet moments between powerful events, by people who believed no one was watching. Someone is always watching. And what is done in those moments, in the space between the miracle and the road home, that is where character is made, and where destiny is sealed. If this story moved you, if it made you see something you hadn't seen before, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories buried in plain sight, and there are many more waiting. The past has more to teach us than we've been told.